weather related. So they were hedging their bets before they got the number. But of course, there were other reasons to suspect.
We got Toshiba P875-s7200.
Negative economic data recently, including just yesterday, with respect to jobs. We got the weekly unemployment claim that came out, and it was a jump to 320,000. That was the second week in a row that we were above 300,000. People were expecting the rate to fall off. Instead, it rose, and now it's at the highest level in 10 months. We also got the Challenger report for February job cuts, better than 50,000 announced layoffs in the month of February. That's the second consecutive month of more than 50,000 layoffs, according to Challenger. In fact, year to date, right, you got 2 months into the year, but we're already 19% ahead of last year's layoff pace. And supposedly, this is the year where the economy is strong enough for the Fed to raise rates, yet we're laying off 19% more people this year than last. We also got fourth quarter productivity. That number dropped by a greater than expected 2.2%. Even Greenspan's been out there talking about how productivity is a problem, and yet it continues to fall. But probably the most bearish of the numbers we got yesterday was factory orders, which fell for the 6th consecutive month. Right? This is rare. The last 2 times that we had factory orders fall 6 months in a row, the U.S. economy was already in recession. It happened in 2008. It happened in 2001. So we already are seeing economic data points that you only see during the recession. Now that can mean one of 2 things. One, the U.S. economy is already in recession, or that this is how bad our recovery is. If we're in recovery, yet factory orders are this bad, imagine what's going to happen when we go to a recession. Because clearly, we're going to have another one. We haven't repealed the business cycle. So to me, it shows you how weak the data is. And of course, almost all the data points that we've received so far in 2015 have been negative, with a few exceptions, one being the job numbers, because the jobs numbers for January were better than expected, and they were better than expected again for February. Let's get right to the report. According to the government, 295,000 jobs were created in February, much higher than the consensus. They did revise last month down a little bit, from 257 to 239. No one really talked so much about that. But this month was 295 versus 230 estimates, and this is great news. The unemployment rate also went down to 5.5%. Remember, it ticked up 1% last time to 5.7, and so now it came all the way back down to 5.5, which I think ties, or is a new record low. I think the low before was 5.6, at least for this cycle. So it was the low unemployment number and the bigger non-farm payroll number that everybody was excited about. The dollar had a huge run today, new highs across the board for the year for the move, multi-year highs again, against the euro. Gold was down about $30. The stock market did not like this number, and I'm going to get back to the number in a minute. But on the stock market, the market had been rising on non-farm payroll days, and in fact, if you go back over the last year, the market was actually doing better on when the number beat. So a supposedly good jobs number was good for the stock market. When the jobs number missed expectations, where we didn't create as many jobs, the stock market still went up, but by not nearly as much. Well, today we had a beat, right? Stronger than expected jobs numbers, and the Dow closed off almost 300 points. 278, I think. It was down about 300 on the lows. Very weak day. The weakest, technically, was the NASDAQ, because the NASDAQ, traded above 5,000 for the first time in 15 years on Monday. It closed above 5,000 too. But it closed not only down on the week, but it was an outside week where we took out last week's high and closed below last week's low. Now, from a technical pattern, that is called a key reversal, and it's a very bearish sign for that index. as a result of today's sell-off, both the S&P 500 and the Dow are basically flat on the year. They're slightly above where they closed the last trading day of 2014. And basically, we could surrender all the gains when trading resumes next week. And it's also interesting that it happened on a day where the non-farm payroll beat. So now, good news isn't good news. Good news is bad news, because everybody
right here, you have to kind of
that the Fed is going to raise interest rates now in June based on this number. And I think one of the reasons the market hasn't risen recently is because more people were coming to my way of thinking, at least about June rate hikes, thinking that they were off the table, because the economic data had been so bad that people were thinking, well, the Fed is going to wait. But now that they've got this jobs data, everybody's convinced that they're going to move in June. Well, I don't know why. I mean, there's nothing about this data that should change the Fed's mind. I mean, it's the same type of jobs numbers we've been getting all year long. And so if the Fed wasn't, about to raise rates based on the January number, which it clearly wasn't,
so now
based
we just
on
put
Janet
the
Yellen's most recent
fingers here
testimony,
and press it this
why
way.
should it raise it now? I mean, there's nothing remarkable about this number. I mean, it's the same old as far as I'm concerned. So if the Fed wasn't going to jack up interest rates a year ago or 6 months ago, this isn't going to change their mind. I mean, let's actually delve more deeply into the numbers. First of all, the labor force participation rate went down from 62.9 to 62.8. Now, the lowest it's been, since the 1970s is 62.7. And of course, we put that in recently. So we're almost back to the lows in labor force participation. Average hourly earnings were only up 0.1%. That's half of the 0.2% that had been expected. So wage growth is non-existent, and labor force participation is going down. I mean, this is not a good sign. If the economy was strong, some of those people that had, left the labor force should have come back in. In fact, the number of people not in the labor force hit an all-time record high. In fact, this is a very interesting statistic, that for every one person that entered the labor force, 3 people left. Right? 96,000 new people came into the labor force, but 354,000 exited the labor force. So the labor force is shrinking. The number of Americans not working is rising. This is not a sign of a strong economy. This does not bode well for tax revenue or government deficits when all these people are no longer in the workforce. Now, people on television, Mark Zandi was on CNBC saying, oh, this is about the baby boomers retiring. No, it's not. This isn't about people retiring. This is about people just retiring from working, not retiring because they're 65 and they don't want to work anymore. They're just thrown in the towel. They're just deciding that they don't want to work because either they can't find a job or being on the dole is more lucrative than having a job. But these are not older people retiring. The baby boom is too broke to retire. People in their 50s are staying in the labor force longer. We have record numbers of people working in their 70s.
So
80s.
You see that table gets decided right there.
The problem is younger people that can't get jobs. So that's the reason that the unemployment rate dropped, because 354,000 people left the labor force. That's why the unemployment went down 2/10.
So as you can see, they're not connected in any way.
The total number of jobs created was 295,000. Now, if only 96,000 people entered the labor force, what is that telling you? How do you create 295,000 jobs for 96,000 people?
Part-time.
Well, what it means is that a lot of the people who got jobs were already in the labor force and already had jobs. In other words, a lot of the jobs are second jobs.
Exactly.
People have one part-time job and they got another part-time job. That's what's going on. The numbers don't differentiate how many hours you work in your job. When they're talking about the jobs being created, if you get a job and you get 1 hour a week, that's a job. That's one job as far as the statistics is concerned. Because I think that that's what's going on. Because most of the people who left the labor force, they didn't have jobs and quit, which is what you would do if you're retiring, right? If you're retiring, you quit your job. You're working and then you retire. I think most of the people who left the labor force were unemployed, and then they took themselves out of the labor force, which is why the unemployment rate went down. Because if somebody quits a job and leaves the labor force, that doesn't affect the unemployment rate because they were never unemployed. But if you're already unemployed and then you leave the labor force, that reduces the unemployment rate. But if you're unemployed and leave the labor force, you're not retiring. You just gave up looking for a job. It's only if you have your job and quit it and don't look for another one
Smart
that you
ideas,
can say, well, it's the baby boomer retiring. So what's
all
really
right,
going
so
on
but
is
we're
people
still
who are
gonna
not
put a
in the
brand
labor
new one
force
right here
are leaving the
because
labor force, so the unemployment rate goes down.
because
We have
the
some
inside
people
might be
who are
already
in the
been
labor force,
worn.
but not nearly as many as the jobs that were created. And the only real explanation for that difference can be that these are second jobs. Now, there's another explanation, and it has to do with the birth-death model. Right? 45% of the 295,000 jobs that the government claims were created in February, they have no proof that they were actually created. They are added into the numbers based on what the government calls the birth-death model. And that number this month was 132,000. So 132,000 jobs out of the 295,000 were just assumed to have been created by the businesses that the statisticians at the Bureau of Labor Statistics assume were started up. Now, what makes them so sure that 132,000 people were hired by startups in the month of February? Especially with all that cold weather out there and all that snow, right? I thought, how are they supposed to start up all these businesses? Now, I think this is where just the bias comes in. Because these are all assumptions, right? And they're only as good as the people who are making them, or as accurate. Now, if you work for the Department of Labor Statistics, you work for the government, you believe the economy is strong. Everybody in the government, right? Everybody's talking about how strong the economy is. This is the greatest economy, in a generation. I don't know what, everything is great. Unemployment is down, right? The Fed's ready to raise rates. We're the only strong economy in the world. So everybody is so optimistic. Well, optimistic statisticians are going to assume that businesses are being created in this great economy. After all, right, in a good economy, you would expect businesses to be created. So since the government workers believe it's a good economy, they believe businesses have been created. And so they assume they've been created. And they assume they hire people. But what if these assumptions are wrong? What if the economy is much weaker than these government bureaucrats think? Well, then these new companies aren't starting up. In fact, it's possible that old companies are going out of business, that they're failing, that more companies are dying than being born. But the government isn't assuming this. They don't realize that companies are dying because they think the economy is strong when it's actually weak. And a weak economy wouldn't be creating a lot of new businesses. It would be destroying the old businesses. But all of this is based on an assumption. And I think that makes a lot of sense because almost all the economic data that comes out is negative, with the exception of the jobs numbers. But there's so much bias and so much assumption in the way these numbers are calculated that there's a lot more room for error than in a lot of other numbers where they just count things up, right? So if there's an outlier here, it's in the jobs number. On CNBC today, Mark Zandi, he was talking about the disconnect between weak GDP and the weak jobs. And in his mind, well, he says at some point, years from now, they're going to come back and revise upward the GDP. Because to him, he thinks, well, since the jobs numbers are so strong, the economy must be a lot stronger than the government thinks. Well, to me, it's more realistic that these jobs numbers are wrong, and they're going to get revised down because we have so much bad economic news. The jobs news is really the only good news. So that's the outlier. So what makes more sense, that all the other news is wrong, and that the job data is right, or that all the other news is right and the job data is wrong? That makes a lot more sense, especially when you think about all of the assumptions. I mean, here's one in particular. We got the Challenger number out yesterday about layoffs in February. And according to this private estimate, they claim that over 16,000 jobs were lost in the oil and gas industry. That makes sense, right? The rig count is plunging. Oil prices are way down. the energy sector is really cutting back on their employees. Well, how many jobs do you think the government assumed were lost in February in the oil and gas sector? 1,100. 1,100. I mean, so the government says we lost 1,100 jobs. Challenger says we lost more than 16,000. Who's right? You know, to me, it's much more likely that Challenger got it right. I mean, it makes a lot more sense that more than 1,100 people lost their jobs in the oil and gas sector, given the collapse in drilling that's taking place. And so this raises two concerns. One, well, how did the government get such a low number? Obviously, they're missing some job losses that they're not taking into consideration, because clearly their number is way wrong. It's way too low. There's a lot more people who lost their jobs than they're counting. So that's number one. But number two, if they got the jobs wrong in the energy sector, what does that say about the accuracy of the rest of the report? Because clearly they got the jobs numbers wrong in oil and gas. Right? Well, if they're wrong in oil and gas, then maybe they're wrong about everything. I mean, maybe you could just take this whole jobs data and throw it out because it's unreliable. It's very suspect, not only based on all the other data that we get that's negative, but based on what we can see. It doesn't make any sense that they're missing these jobs. So to me, it's all an outlier. Yet Wall Street puts all their stock in this number as if, aha, this is proof. Because the Fed keeps talking about jobs. But if you listen to what Janet Yellen most recently said, she says we need to see a big improvement in the jobs picture. This report doesn't show that. It shows the labor force participation rate falling near a record low, hundreds of thousands of people leaving the labor force, wages stagnant. This is, again, the same old, same old. This eventually, right, all the people who left the labor force need to come back in. These are not elderly people playing golf in retirement. These are able-bodied people in their 20s and 30s that should be working but who are not. And if we actually had a strong economy, the labor force participation rate would be growing as these young Americans, re-entered the workforce. The fact that that's not happening, that it's still shrinking, is a sign of a weak economy, and that the unemployment rate does not tell the real story, especially when so many people are underemployed. Right? I mean, because if you pass laws, which we've done with Obamacare, that basically tells employers, get rid of your full-time workers, replace them with part-time workers, by definition, they're going to have to pull more people into the workforce if they're going to reduce the hours of all the people that they employ. So sure, we're going to create a lot of low-paying jobs, but that's not how you build an economy, and that's not the result of a strong economy. So I don't see how anything changes. With Wall Street, everybody seems to think that this number is a game changer. Of course, if the Fed really is going to raise interest rates in June, then what's going to happen to the stock market? It's going to keep going down. It's going to go way down. What's going to happen to the real estate market? It's going to go way down. And what's going to happen to all the speculators that own properties? They're going to try to sell them. What about all the foreigners that bought up a bunch of properties? They're not buying anymore. They can't afford it with a strong dollar. If anything, they might want to list their properties for sale to take advantage of the huge gains that they're looking at in the foreign exchange. And the average guy, the first-time home buyer, he's barely in the market as it is. Well, higher mortgage rates will just, that'll be the end of it. I mean, they'll be out completely. So the housing market starts to come down, and all these bad economic numbers are going to get even worse. In fact, now, the first quarter GDP numbers, despite these supposed good job growth, now you've got the Atlanta Fed that's brought their estimate for first quarter GDP all the way down to 1.2%. So how is the government going to be raising rates in that weakened economy? And in fact, if the economy is already this weak without rate hikes, and now we start factoring them in, and the market goes down, the real estate market goes down, that's going to put even more downward pressure on this global economy. You see, these are the dots that nobody can connect. If you think the U.S. economy is strong, right, and then you think the Fed's going to raise rates, raising rates will put the economy back into recession. Because the only reason it looks strong is because rates are zero, because we've had all this QE. And that's why the economy looks like it's strong. If you then make the conclusion, well, it's strong, so we can raise rates, and it's not strong anymore. You take away the source of its strength. Right? Now, it's not really a strong economy, it's a bubble, and if you stop blowing air into it, it deflates, right, which is what's already happening. Right? But people don't put two and two together. If the Fed raises rates, then the stock market goes down, the real estate market goes down, the economy's back in recession, and the Fed has to cut rates back to zero and do QE again. Well, if raising rates means they have to cut rates, then they can't really raise rates at all. That is the box they're in. But nobody wants to stop and consider that. Now, the jobs data wasn't the only economic data that came out today. And we also got the trade deficit for January, which came out pretty much in line with estimates, maybe a little bit above some estimates. It was a slight improvement from the horrible number we had in December, 41.8 billion. But I think this might have been affected by the port strike, because I think the slowdown in the West Coast ports meant that we couldn't import as much stuff as we might have normally imported, because there's not much exports going out of that, those ports there. It's mostly imports coming in from Asia, and so probably that cut back on some of the imports. So I would think that the trade deficits maybe next month will make up for that. We'll have a bigger jump. But even with the slowdown and the backlogs in the West Coast ports, we still printed $41.8 billion in 1 month, which is a lot of red ink. I think it's interesting too how everybody looks at this. I'm on the Bloomberg's economic calendar website, and they're trying to explain the relevance of the international trade. And I'm going to read from their description what they write here. It says, exports grow when foreign economies are strong. And then it says, imports grow when U.S. economic growth is robust. Right? Now, so think about that for a minute. So they're saying that exports grow when foreign economies are strong. Well, why don't exports grow when our economy is strong? You see, a real strong economy would be churning out more production, right? A strong economy would be producing more stuff and exporting. See, whether or not foreign economies are strong or weak. In fact, if there are weak foreign economies and they can't produce as much, they would need to buy our stuff. So it's the strong economy that produces more than it consumes and has exports. But see, they got it fast backwards. See, they're saying that exports grow when overseas markets are strong. No, in fact, when overseas markets are strong, they produce more, right? They might be, they'll consume their own production. See, the whole idea is America doesn't even have factories, right? We don't produce stuff. It's just the overseas markets. Because that's what they say here. They say that when imports grow, that's a sign that the U.S. economy is strong. No, it's not. It's a sign that our economy is weak. It's a sign that we're not producing enough of the things that we need, and so we have to import the stuff instead because we can't produce it domestically. Now, what it usually is a sign of a bubble, yes, but we have to borrow more money and import the things that our weak economy can't produce. Yes, it's a sign that we got a bubble. It's a sign that interest rates are too low, that the Fed is encouraging too much consumption. That's what it's a sign of. It's not a sign of real economic strength. If the economy was strong, we would be producing the things that we consume. The fact that we can't produce the things that we consume, the fact that we have to import them and borrow to pay for it, is a sign of how weak the economy is. But Bloomberg doesn't even get that. In their economic reports, they're saying that growing imports is a sign of U.S. economic strength. No, it's a sign of U.S. economic weakness. The more we have to import, the weaker the economy. In fact, the trade deficit reflects that way in the GDP. When the trade deficit gets bigger, our GDP goes down. So at least the people who figured out the computation for GDP, they knew that if you're importing more than you're exporting, they subtract that from GDP. I mean, the way Bloomberg writes that, they think you should add it. We should be adding the trade deficit and subtracting the trade surplus. But of course, we don't do it that way because it is not a sign of economic strength. But again, this is how the media, this is how everybody perceives of things today. In a world where, inflation is good, trade deficits are also good. That's the way everybody thinks. But the number that came out later in the day that nobody seemed to pay attention to was consumer credit. And consumer credit actually declined. They were looking for 15 billion growth, and it only grew by 11.6 billion. And that was the slowest rate of growth since November of 2013. which to me, it's a good thing that consumers are taking on less debt. But the reason they're doing it is because the economy is so weak and they're so broke. I mean, if we really had a strong economy that was creating these new jobs, the way Americans typically respond is they go out and buy stuff on a credit card because now they have a job and they can afford it. The fact that consumer credit growth is slowing should be very problematic for people who are looking for the U.S. consumer to power GDP growth. And in fact, credit card debt actually fell. I mean, that's very rare, but credit card debt actually fell. And again, what that shows, we have this rising savings rate, and now we have a reduction in credit card debt. A lot of that is because of lower gas prices. Instead of spending this supposed windfall from lower gas prices, Americans are saving the difference, or they are not using their credit card as much. See, if people were so broke and they have to put gas on their credit card, well, now if gas is cheaper, they don't have to put as big a bill on the credit card. So it shows that Americans are simply borrowing less money to buy their gas because the gas is less expensive, right? So there is no big windfall. But again, if consumers are flush with these new jobs, why aren't they spending the extra money? It's because it isn't extra money. It's just less money they have to borrow because they're barely making it. And of course, the total level of debt continues to rise, albeit at a slower pace, mainly because of car loans and student loans. But again, this is a bad sign that Americans keep on taking on student debt. You know, they're doing that despite the fact that most college grads are underemployed. You know, they're waiting tables and tending bar or whatever they're doing. Yet now people are borrowing money. In fact, I think a lot of people are just not even really in college for the education. They're in there for the loans. They just have to enroll in order to borrow the money. But the money is really going to their utilities and their rent and things like that. And then we have all this money that's being borrowed in car loans, even as delinquencies are soaring because we've got so many subprime auto buyers that are taking out, 7-year car loans. Imagine 7 years worth of payments on a car that, how many people drive cars for 7 years that actually drive them? And a lot of people, of course, are using 0% financing, and when they buy the car, they're driving into the showroom with a car that maybe they have a $10,000 loan on, and the value of the car is only $5,000. So they're already upside down, but then they buy a new $30,000 car, and the dealership says, well, we'll throw your negative equity into the loan, and we'll loan you $35,000 to buy this $30,000 car, and we'll give you 7 years 0% interest. And so the guy says, that's a great deal. And he just walks out the door with his brand new car. How many of these loans are going to go into default? A lot. Who knows? I mean, maybe most of these loans, we'll see, could end up in default. But that's where a lot of this debt is growing. But the fact that there's this big slowdown shows that the consumer is struggling. And all the other data suggests that he's struggling, yet people want to focus in on these jobs numbers. And again, if you look at the jobs, right, most of the jobs that are being created are in these low-wage sectors. We only created, I think, 6,000 manufacturing jobs. I mean, a tiny number, right? Almost all the jobs, I think, better than half the jobs that were created. Of course, 45% of them might not have been created at all, right? Because they're just made up out of thin air. I said with the birth-death model. But assuming these jobs actually exist, which is a stretch, more than half of them are pretty low-paying jobs. Right? They're in the restaurant industry. Right? People are waiters, waitresses, bartenders. They're working in hotels. Right? They're bus boys, or they're bellboys, or chambermaids, or they work behind the counter when you check in. Right? In hospitality. They're in retail. They're stock boy or stock girl or cashier. Things like that, working at Walmart, a greeter. I mean, all these retail jobs. There's jobs as teachers, hospitals, orderlies. Not when they have all these healthcare jobs, they're not doctors. By and large, these are just people that are doing low-skill work in healthcare. So these are where the jobs are, and a lot of these jobs are part-time, and even the ones that are full-time don't pay very much. And meanwhile, the cost of living is still going up, despite the fact that people have a bit of a reprieve with lower gas prices. In general, prices are going up. And so people, people are stressed. And of course, the last thing they can afford is a hike in their interest rate. When people have all these debt and they're surviving on credit, the least that they can afford is an increase in interest rates. And of course, the government itself is the most vulnerable, because if interest rates go up and it pushes the economy into recession, you get a double whammy for the government. Because now the tax revenues go down because it's a recession. They got more people collecting benefits, so the deficit gets bigger. But now the cost to finance the existing national debt, as well as the new debt, goes way up. And so the budget deficit skyrockets, which is another reason why they can't raise interest rates. But again, the whole world
does the old jack and this connector is not
fantasy world where the
for
Fed
this
can
guy.
raise interest rates
It's
and everything is going to be fine. Even though the only reason that things haven't imploded is because rates are so low.
Don't use aftermarket stuff.
We can continue to
This
pretend
is
that we
aftermarket
can afford to pay our bills as long as we don't really have to pay. But the minute we have to pay interest on the money we borrowed, well, then the fantasy comes to an end because we can't afford it. And of course, we totally can't afford to repay the loans. Right? Nobody wants to think about that. Right? We can no more repay our debt than Greece can repay its, but at least we can pretend that we will one day because we can make the interest payments. Right? Just like when people bought houses, a subprime market in the housing bubble, they could afford the teaser rate. There's no way they could actually afford to repay the loan. But for a while, the people holding those subprime mortgages were happy just to get their monthly payments. But it hadn't occurred to them that the people who were making these monthly payments couldn't actually afford to repay the loan. So they can pretend for a while they had a piece of paper